Hello YouTube! Welcome to Coding with Dom. I'm Dom and this is me coding. Today we will be looking at the concept of visual regression testing. What that basically means is being able to take a screenshot of your website or your application or your web application or whatever you want to call it, and then comparing those screenshots throughout time to make sure that you don't introduce any visual regressions or visual bugs. So this is very useful in large code bases when you want to start adding tests. One of the first tests that are very easy to add are visual regression tests. You can test very small pieces of the page, you can test the whole page, and then you can test the whole page, and you can then compare that throughout time on various browsers to make sure that if you change some CSS in one part of the code, that you don't produce a side effect in a separate part of the code. As usual, if you enjoy this video, please leave a like, subscribe, let me know down below in the comments, and let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look into this library called NightwatchVRT. So this is what we're going to be using today to do visual regression testing, and it's very simple to use. So we're going to be going through the configuration and the README together. I've used this a long time ago with the old version of Nightwatch, so there might be something in the new version that might be causing some issues, but we'll find that out together. So basically we need to, what I'm going to do, just to make sure that we, how can we do this? I'm going to separate this configuration into a new file so that I'm sure that I don't break my Travis build, because I don't want to run these on Travis, and there is a reason for that. The reason is, if you run these kind of tests on Travis, or if you run them in CI, you can do that, but you need to pay careful attention to this concept, which is browser rendering on different machines, different operating systems. If I were to take a screenshot of something on my configuration on this Mac, on a Chrome, it might not necessarily render the same way on Travis on a Linux machine on Chrome. So if you want to do visual regression testing and run those in CI, you really want to make sure that you're using the same Docker image possibly, or some other mechanism to make sure that you're using the same operating system and browser configuration, both when you run tests locally and when you run tests in CI. So that's a challenge you need to make sure that you think of before you start adding visual regression tests into CI. But you can use mechanisms like browser stack, you can use Docker images to run tests both locally and in CI. Try and Google stuff like Selenium Chrome Docker image or stuff like that. You'll find some Docker images that might help you out with this. But for the sake of just showing you how visual regression actually works, I'm just going to create a new configuration file and run this just locally, so I don't have to worry about integrating these tests into CI. So for the time being, what I'm going to do something very similar to what we did with the browser stack configuration. So I'm just going to import this base configuration. Let me just do this a second. I don't think you can see very well. So require the Nightwatch configuration and module.exports config. Now we aren't going to change the way WebDriver is imported, but we are going to add this extra configuration here. Now this is referring to a node model NightwatchVRT, which I haven't added yet, so I'm going to do this. And not only do we need, so what are we doing here? We're basically telling Nightwatch to load these custom commands and custom assertions. Now these are topics I haven't necessarily covered in any video, so this is a good chance to do that. What custom commands are is basically adding your own commands to the Nightwatch library. So just like we have click, set value, all this kind of stuff to perform operations on the browser, NightwatchVRT provides a subset of commands that we can use specifically for visual regression testing, and this is where we load them into the Nightwatch client. The same goes for custom assertions. So custom assertions are things like expect visible and stuff like that. We can load our own assertions, and in this case we're going to be asserting that a screenshot hasn't changed over time. And so we do that by loading these extra assertions. If you want to understand more what custom commands and custom assertions are, I recommend you see my previous video on page objects, or you look into the Nightwatch documentation page for that. Then we have a series of custom settings. Let me increase zoom here. And these are specific to visual regression testing. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm pretty sure that this is under test settings default. So I'm going to say config.test settings.default equals, oh dear, nope, let me copy this, default.globals equals this guy. Yes. So I'm just going to do an fix OK. Now we don't have a default screenshot path generator, so I'm guessing that it's going to explain how to do that. Yes, indeed. So I'm just copying the basic, the README. Yeah. So this should be enough for me. Where is it complaining here? Okay. Generate screenshot file path. Fine. And then we're going to need path. Okay, so here I'm importing path, which is a node module default. It comes packaged with node. You don't need to add this. Did this go through? Okay, yes. So path is required here to create this function called generate screenshot file path. And what this is a function that visual regression uses to define what the path name for a given screenshot will be. Sounds complicated, but it's really simple. All it does is it grabs the name, the module of the test that we're running, and the name of the test we're running, and then it saves this into a specific folder. But we'll see this afterwards while we're running a test. It will become a lot more clear. I am going to add a new folder for our visual regression tests. So we'll have VRT tests. This is again to make sure that we don't run those tests. Oops, that was a mistake. This is again to make sure that we don't run these tests in CI. So we'll have VRT.js, which is fine. And so rather than having, where do we have our base configuration, has source folders tests, we will have source folders VRT tests. So I think we've set up most of it. Let me just go over these configuration options real quickly. But I think the README for this package explains things pretty well, but still. We're explaining how to generate the screenshot path. We're having a look, we're explaining where to save the latest and the baseline. So the baseline is where we're going to save the examples of how we want things to be. So before we can actually test, when we run the test, we have two options. We can run the test so that it saves the baseline, or we can run the test so that it compares against the baseline. Obviously, we need to do this first test run where we save the baseline before we can test it against anything. So when you create your test suite with visual regression, when you create a new test, what you're going to have to do is update the baseline before you can run the tests against that baseline. I'm sure it makes sense, but the whole idea behind this is that you're going to have some folders which you're going to save into Git, and that you're going to version. VRT baseline is one of those, while latest and diff you're probably not going to save into Git, because those are the artifacts that come out of a test run comparing against baseline. We'll see how this works in a minute. I'm sure it'll make more sense. Latest suffix, baseline suffix, I'm sure this is stuff where we can be a bit more precise. Threshold is a number that basically defines how precise the comparison needs to be. So if we increase this number, then the comparison will be less precise. In my experience, if you're using the same browser and the same operating system, you don't have to worry about this number. You can leave it to 0. And I think it's a better practice to make sure that you use the same browser so that you can leave this number to 0, rather than doing the opposite, which is increasing this number so that you can fiddle around and use different browsers locally and in CI. I don't think that's the way to go. Font rendering is probably the biggest problem when it comes to doing visual regression testing. But again, if you're using the same browser and the same operating system, every time you run the test, this number will stay on a 0. Prompt, I'm not too sure what prompt actually is. If true, the user will be prompted to override baseline screenshot when the recently captured screenshot differs. Always save. Okay, so always save diff screenshot. This is this true-false boolean will actually decide whether we are saving the screenshots or whether we are testing the screenshots. So by default, this is false in the example, but what we want to do is make this a variable so that we can have two different test scripts in our package.json, one to actually save the baseline and one to run the tests. So what I'm going to do is start off by doing a test VRT, which will use my nightwatch.vrtconf, and then we are going to have rather than test VRT, we can do test VRT. What am I going to call this? Consolidate VRT. I'm not sure whether that's the best naming, but we're going with that. So what we're going to do is consolidate equals 1. And basically, I'm going to be setting, what I'm doing is I'm setting an environment variable before I start running the test. So by doing this, I can then say process.env.consolidate equals 1. So if consolidate is 1, it means that I need to always save diff screenshot, and so I'm actually updating the baseline. If it is not, then it means that I'm actually running a test. Okay, this is all fine and dandy. What we've been talking about up until now is just configuring the thing. So we've installed the module, we've created the basic configuration, now we need to actually create a test. So I'm going to copy my first test, which is the Hacker News test, and what we're going to do for now, I'm just going to run test VRT, and actually there is another thing I want to do because I want to get rid of the headless mode. Actually, no, it's fine. Test VRT just to make sure that everything is working so far. My first test case, boom. Okay, so how do we actually use this library? So what we want to do is this library adds this custom assertion, like I said, which on the inside uses the custom commands that have been added, but all we care about is this custom assertion. So assert screenshot identical to baseline, and what it wants is a selector. And the way it works is that it looks for that selector, it cuts a little image of that selector and it puts it into a specific folder, which is what we've defined in the configuration. If we're running the baseline, it cuts it and it puts it in the baseline folder. If we're running a test, it cuts it and it puts it in the latest folder. Then it compares that against the baseline and creates a new folder called diff, and it puts the diff between the two images into that folder. So optionally, you can add a custom name, you can add this custom threshold, custom extra custom options. Look into the documentation if you're interested in knowing what the custom options are. But for the moment, what I'm going to do is, rather than actually, let's do this. news.ycombinator.com. Okay, so what I want to test is the whole header bar. So let's see if I can get that somehow. What if I look for a TD with big E color equals There are 2 of those. It's going to get the first. I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to go for this. So if you remembered my first video, a very important rule that I explained is that if a selector gives more than one element, like in this case 1 of 2, you should try and pick a selector which is more precise and that yields just 1 element. I don't control this website, otherwise I could add an ID, I could add a class, I could add all sorts of stuff to make it more specific. I'm not going to be doing that, and I'm not going to worry for that, and I'm going to do the exact opposite of what I recommended you doing. So we are going to test for this TD, and then we can copy this thing, assert. I'm not going to assert for contain text. I'm going to assert screenshot identical to baseline, and then I'm going to grab this again. Actually, let's do this. Header selector. And this will also be header selector. Const header selector. Okay, then we have optional things. This is going to be my header. Hacker news header. And the extra custom options I am not interested in. Now, let's give this a go. npm run test vrt. So what's happened? What's happened is because the baseline screenshot does not exist, it's saving the current screenshot to the baseline directory. So that's what the library is able to do for us. If the baseline does not exist yet, it creates it for us without us having to use that special flag that we added in the package.json script. So what we have right here inside VRT baseline VRT, which is the folder that we defined inside NightwatchVRT let's look at baseline screenshots path is VRT baseline, and then it uses some of this magic to add this into this folder, HN header, and we have a very nice screenshot of the header. If I run it again, it will not override this because it already exists. It will just check it, and the screenshot for selector was captured successfully. Visual regression test results for element. And now, if I reload this, not only should I have baseline, but there should also be latest. Okay, I wasn't expecting that. But it seems to be working fine. Maybe it only creates latest and diff when there are actually differences. So I wanted to test that as well. What we're going to do is I'm going to open this. How can I edit this image? Let's open this in Finder. And maybe what I can do is edit this somehow with preview. I think this will allow me to draw on it or something. Let's have a look. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm cropping the image. I'm saving that. So now we can see that the baseline has become this cropped image, which isn't what we should have in the website. So if I run test again, I expect the test to fail because the screenshot is different. And here we are. We have error running, screenshot identical to baseline. The visual regression test results for element expected true, but got. So the error message might not be the clearest error message in the world, but the point is our visual regression test has failed. So if we go into the latest, we can see this is the latest image, which is what it was before. This is the baseline, and in diff we have something like this. So you can see that there's all kinds of differences in this image because we cropped the image and it doesn't make any more sense. So let's pretend that we've updated something in the website and that's the reason why our tests are failing. How do we make sure to update the baseline without actually updating the image? That's why we added a script called consolidate. This will add the consolidate equals 1 flag, which will mean don't compare screenshots, just grab it again. Okay, I fell into a JavaScript trap, obviously, because what I was checking for is where the consolidate is 1, which is true. But if I do a triple equals, like I was, consolidate is 1 as a string. and not as a number. So I think if I do this, it should do what I expect it to do, which is true. And now it should be able to consolidate the baseline. Of course, JavaScript always surprises me, and I forget these kind of things every day. But a day in the life of a dev, am I right? So let's run consolidate again. Consolidate VRT. If all goes well, it should ignore the fact that the two screenshots are different, and indeed it has, and it's updated the header image. Again, now what remains is for me to update my gitignore file, saying that I am going to ignore vrt.latest and vrt.diff, because these two are going to be the products of each test run, just like the reports, the tests output folder is, so I don't want to commit these into Git. This has been a very brief overview of how to do. Another thing that you might want to keep in mind while doing visual regression testing is that for an element like a header, which has very rare and very, let's say you're not going to update the header every day, it doesn't have dynamic content, there you go, it's a static piece of HTML. You can test something like the header like I just did. I'd go ahead and test something in that way, but something like testing the article block would be very risky to test this article with a visual regression test if you're not mocking the content, because the content is going to change. Every time the content changes, your test is going to fail. So you're going to need to find a way to mock that data inside your application. There are tons of ways of doing that, and Nightwatch doesn't necessarily help you in any way with that. That's something that's more on the application level. But do keep that in mind, that when you're doing visual regression testing, you will have to worry about these kind of things. If your company has some kind of design system, if you have a components list, that's a perfect candidate for visual regression testing, because usually components or design systems, they are things that are very static, that are based on mocked content or faked content, so they are perfect candidates for visual regression testing. Just like static content inside a website is also a perfect candidate. So this was visual regression testing. I hope you found it useful. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, share it with your grandma, and thank you for showing your support. Thanks for following so far. I'll see you next time.